You're able to see my screen, right? So, guys, let's start Docker. Okay, and so one certain example, why does Docker came into existence or prevalence, or it got the importance so much? Is there used to be a revolution called as the Hyper-V or VMware revolution. Okay, the virtualization revolution. Okay, so which started when with the time. It started when after the Windows OS or the Linux OS, everything came up into the market. Okay, so people started hosting their application onto servers, either Windows server or Linux server. Okay, and then they were able to host their website in some of the other servers, and then they were happy. But with the time, what happened is people started facing issues like this on the service where they were putting up. They have either issues of they need to configure that particular machine, and then they need to host their application. Okay, and then what happened is the machine was not totally used or fully used. So what the developers across open that have done is they brought up something called as virtualization technology. So the most of the virtualization technology, the Hyper-V, which is being used on Azure Fabric, whether you are rolling out a cloud service or a web app, everything is on the virtualizations on the virtualization softwares only. Okay, like the basic virtualization software which Azure is using is Hyper-V because it's on Microsoft own product. Okay, so the similar virtualization technology which prevailed, and the starting virtualization technology which come up is VMware. So VMware is a company who had actually created this virtualization software which actually can sit on any particular Windows OS or any other OS, and it can actually give support uh, to be able to install another piece of software on another piece of OS itself. So you can see that I have this particular Windows OS which my laptop is running, and on top actually I can install some of the virtualization technologies the virtual box, okay, or something called as VMware. Okay, so this is VMware workstation which we are actually this is from VMware, and or the virtual box is from Oracle. Okay, and the VMware virtualization tool, workstation tool, you can download it for free, and you can you have a lot of images which you can host it up. Okay, but Oracle VM VirtualBox, it gives direct connection to images, whatever if you want a Mac OS or OS X, or you want Linux OS, Ubuntu, or any other OS, it's available, and you can spin that particular VM from the images which they are exposing. Okay, but for VMware you need to get the ISO file, and then you are okay. Okay, this similarly, like you I wanted to show like how this particular virtualization works. Okay, so this is my Windows OS. On top I have VM workstation, and on top of this VM workstation, right, whatever I run, right, that would be a guest operating system for my this native operating system. Whatever, this is a main operating system, bare metal operating system which I'm running. Okay, on top, if I install any virtualization technology and I run OS on top of it, then that would be guest OS to this particular native bare metal OS. Okay, so one particular OS which I'm running is my OS X 10.11 EI Captain OS X. Okay, it's running on this, and it's basic Apple OS X which we have. Okay, we have everything native, and you won't feel that it's part of something else, and without it just consumes hardly of hardly it consumes. Let me go to the window and show you what are the properties of this particular. So the hard disk 150 GB I have assigned. You can actually work with 50 GB of hard disk. I mean from the hard drive, the main hard drive which we have on this laptop. Okay, we can do that, and we have some natting. Okay, we need to do something like basically a basic natting would be done where actually it routes traffic from the Windows OS also is like The OS with the bare metal OS which is running is also having an Ethernet card. There's a single Ethernet card, okay? And via that single Ethernet card, the traffic need to route to Windows OS and also the OS which is running on top of my VMware workstation. Okay, so for that only this NAT is required, and NAT would be done automatically when you install this particular VMware. And in certain case, in certain OSs where virtualization will not be enabled, you need to go to BIOS, okay, and you need to enable the virtualization. If you want to know how to enable the virtualization everything, you can like and they are virtualization. You can go to BIOS and enable virtualization. Once you enable virtualization, you would find in your task manager like the virtualization is enabled. So this is my Windows 8 system. Okay, and I'll go to performance and you can see the virtualization is enabled. Okay, once the virtualization is enabled, you can install any of the VMware softwares, or you can run even the Docker which we are going to talk about today. Okay, so I uh, would love to open one particular URL where I have explained the initial issues with uh, and that particular channel I have mentioned about the initial issues with the Azure installation. Okay, I had a lot of issues while working with the Azure installations. Okay, so for that, what you need to have is like Docker. Just the Azure guy and Docker. I didn't get any proper answers on how to fix any issues with Azure installations. Okay, so how to set up Dockers on Windows 8 and 10 and fix that particular initial issues which we have. Okay, and this talks about the issues what we have, this particular video. Okay, everything and how to install on Windows 8 or Windows 10, I have talked about it. Okay, so what is the difference between the Windows 8 operating systems of Windows 10 operating system is like the Windows 8 doesn't, or still Windows 10 Enterprise to have Hyper-V installed by default. Okay, just you need to enable virtualization at BIOS, but Hyper-V is available by default. Okay, but with Windows 8 you don't have any Hyper-V installed on top of it, so that for that only we need to have either VMware Workstation or Oracle VM VirtualBox to run our Docker stuff. Okay, so I was talking about the virtualization which we can do by running so one particular, I mean three particular tools: VMware or VirtualBox or Hyper-V by default on Windows systems. Okay, so Hyper-V was not available before Windows 10 Enterprise models. You can go to that particular video and fix the installation issues which you will be basically having while installing the Docker. Okay, so let's why I talked about the virtualization, because after this virtualization the concept of Dockers came into it. Okay, so on top of Windows OS we have virtualization, on top of virtualization we have Dockers concept on it. Okay, so it's not like Docker is complete replacement of virtualization, but it's rather maintained or created on top, or it uses virtualization technique to run Linux hosts, or something called as Docker machines hosts. Okay, so what the foremost thing which you need to do before running a Docker, let's go to a set of slides which we have and then we'll jump onto it. So the first thing which when we talk about Dockers is like we had a trend of something called as VMware. Okay, so where the virtualization technology came up, and then we hypervisor came into concept. Okay, and then the hypervisor, the hypervisor is a which maintains I mean like using Hyper-V we actually maintains the virtualization, either it's VMware or Hyper-V. Okay, and then on top of VMware or Hyper-V we have containers or Dockers running onto it. Okay, so it uses virtualization but it doesn't use something called as Hyper-V or VMware, Hyper-V or VMware on top of it. What it does is like previously when we had Hyper-V, This is my server. Okay, think of this is my laptop, and there's a running host OS on top of it. That's my Windows 8 OS, which I'm running currently on it. On top of that, we'll be having Hyper-V. Okay, instead of Hyper-V, we have VMware. We are running it. On top of that, we have Mac OS, which we have right now, or we can have any other Ubuntu, Linux, or any other versions or flavors of Linux, or even other operating system itself. Okay, we can have, and on top of this we'll be hosting our application. Okay, if there's a situation where I can run my application only on a Linux VM, then I need to have a Linux OS on top of it on my single bare metal server, and then I could host my application on top of my Linux server. Okay, think of a scenario where you need complete Apache installation, and your Java application need to run on top of that particular machine. Rather than putting onto a Windows 8 machine, you would would refer to a Linux machine. Okay, so in that cases, like if your application has a very individual requirement of hosting them in very native operating systems, yes, we used to go with this particular virtualization technology and we used to run it. Okay, the same thing what in Azure is the same stuff. So irrespective of whatever operating system we are offering on in from Azure, whether Linux, Ubuntu, or anything, so there would be Azure OS. Okay, server would be there, and each server rack will have Azure OS. In Azure OS, we'll have Hyper-V, and this is very specifically to the Hyper-V is also very specifically designed for Azure. Okay, and then on top of Hyper-V, Azure Hyper-V, we have this all guest OSs. Which can be any flavors, because Azure at Azure Marketplace you have different flavors, Ubuntu or anything available. On top of that, you have your application hosted. If you have your application hosted on top of it, you will have certain sort of local files which would be cached from application will also be hosted. Okay, if you want to take up this particular service, or particular mm, application, you need to you can't take up this particular guest OS and app A to another place. Okay, but you need rather you need to image all of this with host OS, and then you could have moved. Okay, and you'll be having a tightly coupled. You can't take up like yes, possible on Hyper-V you can take a VHD of this particular this particular guest OS and you can take it up, but you can't leave a guest OS and take up snapshot of application and you can go ahead. But that particular the problem or pain point was taken care by containers. So what containers does is like it's just a replacement of Hyper-V. A Docker engine would be there. So Docker engine would be would be responsible for running this particular application, irrespective of whether it need to be run specifically on Linux machine, Ubuntu machine, or another machine. Okay, so Docker engine would run up proper everything. It has everything to run your particular code. Okay, you doesn't need to have Hyper-V with all guest OSs or specific OSs to run your application. So on Docker Engine, any kind of application you can put on and you can run. And when you want to migrate from this particular service or server, or from this particular Docker container, we call as a whole as a Docker container, and these are containers. If you want to move, then it's easy. You can move your app A bin libs easily to another container or another server easily. Okay, and that's possible, and we will go through it how to do this particular stuff. And so if we take an example of, or similar competitor of Docker is Rocket. Okay, and which is called as RKT. And Docker is similarly what it's allowing us is it's allowing us to put our application anywhere, run anywhere, and migrate from it from any time. Okay, irrespective of what particular OS is there underneath it. Okay, so similarly Rocket is also providing the same kind of service, but Docker has got a very renowned uh, implementation and name, and it also have huge a lot of integration with Azure. And if you take an example of, what does a Docker engine would do is like, it would create a lib container where all application, the lib container where all application data would be there, and it would have a virtual directory, and then it's something called as LXC. So LXC, this container which actually take care of interacts with the main hardware, bare metal hardware. Okay, whether it's Linux kernel or Windows OS, anything, the Linux container would, would talk with the Linux kernel. Okay, if it is Windows, then there would be Windows container service would be there, which would be talking with the hardware. So whatever calls would be made from Docker for in order to try, it would translate from LXC to the Linux kernel. That's how, LXC sits in between as a broker between Docker and Linux kernel. So Docker, or containers, when we talk about, you would be possibly looking out to containers where huge ships would be carrying out containers, and then these containers can be shipped onto any other places. Yes, the main principles or the concept behind our particular code, our particular service is also the same. So the same as you can publish or take out your publish containers each and every time. Okay, the same thing like you can, anywhere across the world. The same thing you can actually put your the containers which you create from images in Docker can be transported or published to store.docker, and then it can be, can be used by anyone and can be reused by anyone and can be shared to anyone, and unless you make it as a public. Okay, so what Docker does is like it carves up a computer, my laptop, into a sealed containers that run my code. Okay, so if I'm running my code, my application is hosted on my laptop, so that can be, carved up into a container, and it can be, sealed container. It can be sent anywhere, and it gets a code to and from my computer, and it builds these containers for us, and there's a social platform where we can, share our containers, which are different from virtual machines. Okay, and we can share containers because containers is not an, engulf of virtual machines. Rather, it doesn't have any code of, files related to OS. Rather, it just have application files and few configuration files related to the Docker engine. So what's a container? It's a self-contained sealed unit of software. Contains everything required to run the code, even the batteries. Okay, and a container can have my code files, my config files, my processes, networking dependencies, and OS. Okay, so but when you export a container, you won't be taking up your operating system and other thing. Okay, rather you would be taking the other parts like the codes, configs, and the dependencies. So if you take an example on Linux server, if I host, I can host Red Hat Linux, or this is my container where you can see in gray spaces. So this is Red Hat Linux with database, Ubuntu Linux with one web server, SUSE Linux with one Redis cache. Okay, so these all hosted or running on a Docker engine. So these are different containers. So you can have multiple containers running on a single Docker machine or engine. So the same thing. So there, like on top of Linux server where we have talked about, if you go a little depth, we have a Docker server program, and we have all the containers which are running in, and all the containers talk with or interact with the outside world with using the VNet. Okay, the virtual network which would be created when you install your particular service, and where the netting would be done. And about Docker, it's a client program. That's it. And a server program that manages a Linux system. Okay. And what we does is like we have container on top of container inside the, like we have Docker engine, and then we have something called as Docker. Okay. So Docker is a program, again, client program. And then for interacting with Linux system, we use this particular Docker server program. Okay, and when you install Docker, it automatically installs everything, whether it's a Docker client or Docker which runs inside that particular VM, everything, or the Docker engine host, a program that builds the containers from code. So there are two Docker processes would be running. One outside, which would be running on top of your bare metal OS, and one inside the VM. So about Docker, a service that distributes containers, and it's a company name itself. So my computer will be having a Docker, okay, which it's a program, Docker program, and another one is like I'll be having a virtual box which I'll be hosting from Oracle, okay, and then I'll have a Linux virtual machine which would be spun, which would be called as boot to Docker OS, okay, and then we'll have something called as program named Docker which would be running inside this particular Linux virtual machine. So let's go and check this particular program named Docker. Let's see if I'm not running anything, whether it runs that particular process or not. I'll go to my task manager. So I don't see any of the process related to Docker. Okay. So what I'm gonna do is like I can run this particular process, but we will jump onto it later. But rather what we're gonna do is like we will try to implement the Docker implementation on our Mac OS. Okay. So I'm logged into my OS. So one of the primary things which you need to do is like we need to go to toolbox, because Mac OS or there doesn't have Hyper-V by default because Hyper-V is a Microsoft product. So in this case we need to install something called as Docker Toolbox. Whether it's Windows 8 or Mac OS, we need to install Toolbox. Let me try. My Safari is getting opened. Oops. I'll I'll show you the place where we need to download this particular Docker toolbox. So you can go to something called as docker dot, or just search for Docker toolbox. You will be diverted to this particular link. And if it's Mac, you need to download this. Windows, you need to download this. And ultimately it would download a file, something called as Docker toolbox, and which would look like this. Okay, so this consists of everything. It consists of three different things. One thing is the Oracle VM VirtualBox. Another thing is a Kitematic, and another one is Docker Quickstart Terminal. Okay, the same thing if you install your toolbox and Mac OS, the same thing you would be installed with your VirtualBox. Okay, and you would be installed with Docker Quickstart Terminals and Kitematics. So let's go and open everything. So the process of triggering a proper way of running a Docker is, first you need to open up your VirtualBox which you have installed initially for the first time. Okay, you'll open your VirtualBox first. Okay, you would see your default, it's running. We need to stop this so that it can start well, and otherwise I can go and delete this particular VM itself. As you can see that I have a I'm logged in with a VM workstation. Inside I have another virtual box, means it's virtualization and inside nested virtualization kind of concept here. So I'll be opening my Docker first, I mean my virtual box first, and then I'll be opening my Kitematic. That's a that's a way of opening up or running your proper Docker process. Because what happens is if you open your Kitematic and it won't if you have not opened your virtualization this one software, then it can't actually bring up a Linux VM on top of it. Okay, so if you want to check how does it loads from initially, since I have run it already, so that's why it is showing. So what happens is like when you run this particular virtual box, you won't have any image running onto it. Okay, so rather, and the kinematics will load up, and kinematic will load up with no data in there. It would load up first, it would try to run initially this particular ISO, okay, and this ISO is nothing but image files, and it would try to run that particular ISO called as default OS on top of the virtual box. Okay, so this default OS is nothing but I'll just go and show and find it's just an ISO file, okay, default.vbox virtualbox. These are logs, and let me go where exactly I have all my files related to my Docker. That's my debug file. Default dot ISO. So when I install my Docker toolbox, it will install everything and it will place the default.iso in a location, okay? And you can find from, I mean, that location, I'm trying to find the location, exact location. Not able to open. Okay. So anyway, like it would be in your system, and when you try to run this particular Kitematic, it would actually go ahead and run your default.iso first, and then put that particular image on top of VirtualBox and run the boot 2.order. So after this particular successful, my video which I was talking about, this particular video, right? You have most of the issues with the Kitematic getting started. Okay, that particular issue only I have discussed about. So you can see this particular issue. So when you run Kitematic, it would try to use the throw no VTX check sort of issue. Okay, that you can resolve by going to this particular link, and once that is resolved, you have your Kitematic running. So Kitematic is nothing but it's just a complementary, which is a client which is available um, at your, it's a either Windows native client or Mac OS client. It's an application which actually gets your Docker images, which is available in store.docker.com. Okay, and I'll also show how to get or go to that store.microsoft.com. So you can click here and you can go to view on Docker Hub as well. Okay, so Docker Hub will have a whole lot of all of the images which have been made by few other people, or you can also post your own image and make it publicly available so that it can be useful for other particular enterprise or corporate companies, or person who are testing out other activities. So you can see these particular images which I have downloaded previously, and which I've been running this particular images. And once you download images, what you do is like you actually run it as a container. Okay, so what I can do is like I have this particular VM Nginx. I can actually browse this if I'm still, since I can see that it's still running. Since my browser is not opening, that's why it's not able to open this. Otherwise, what it would do is like it would just open a simple website page showing up this particular voila, your Nginx container is running. Okay, that's a thing it would do. That's it. And if not, if you have images, and this is a UI way of interacting with the images, what you can do is like you can actually run your images. I'll stop this image. Okay, and I would try to run this via commands. We have beautiful commands which can be run via two ways. One way is you can use Docker Quickstart terminal to run your commands. So when you run this particular bash, so you can see, so it would be displaying this particular Docker icon. Let me expand it. It would be displaying my Docker icon, and it would be displaying the IP on which and whatever we do with the port number would be hosted. Okay, so we can host multiple containers. So multiple containers can have multiple websites, or they can have Jenkins is an example of where automated code, everything you can do, and you can host in this particular IP with the port number. Okay, and you can, this is a default machine with IP. So So this it's showing that we are logged into our particular Linux machine, which is running in VirtualBox. Okay, and that's nothing but this is the box on which this is again OS, right? I can actually log into it and I can install something. The same thing, whatever we run containers or anything, we will be running into this particular default machine, which is having this particular IP. Okay, so this is the IP of this particular machine, and this IP and the IP which my machine is running would be different. Okay, so three different IPs are involved here. So one is this particular IP, and another IP is with this particular OS X, and another is a bare metal Windows OS which I'm running on top of underneath it. Okay, so we have three IPs involved, and the networking, everything is already maintained or well handled. So this is the starting page of my Docker. So when I get the page, and in order to check, uh, I call for something called as Docker machine every commands. So let's go back to slides and carry on. So I have my slides here. Okay. So the same thing, that the Docker program would be again, let's go and check our Docker program, which we were about to see. We will see when we will run our Docker program in our Windows OS. Okay. And okay, going next. So the role of images and containers. So terminals which you will be hearing frequently while working with Docker is Docker, Docker image, Docker container, Docker engine, Docker compose, and other terminologies. Okay, so basically what are Docker image I would be talking about. Image is like, you have VHD, right? .vhd file. What you do, you actually take a snapshot of your OS, I mean your complete operating system, and the files whatever there on top of it, right, in it. Okay, the same thing, you can take in Docker image, so which are available at Docker Hub. So same Docker image, you can also build a Docker image, and this image would be, it can be a snapshot of your application with all dependencies which are there in Docker engine or the Linux VM on which you are running. Okay, so it would be a snapshot of that particular image. So you can be having a Ubuntu machine with the node.js and the application code which you are running. It can be a total Docker image, or it can be a once you run this particular Docker image on your Docker engine, it actually runs a container out of it. So Docker image, so you know that like .vhd is an image, and if you make a virtual machine out of it, then that would be a you can make a virtual machine out of your VHD. The same thing, you can make a container out of your image. So container is a runnable thing. Okay, so once you run, you can execute commands, everything on top of it. Okay, but on top of image, what you can do is like you can use the image, create an image or build an image, or read modify an image, that else that one, or publish an image you can do. But from, if you take an image and you're creating a container out of it, from this container you can make multiple images. Like take an example, like I have this particular node.js and application code image which is of Ubuntu image. Okay, so when I run container, it would actually run my node.js and my application on top of a Ubuntu machine. Okay, so in further case, what I do is like I want a MySQL server also as well on top of it, so I can install MySQL server, or call up MySQL server and configure it on this particular Docker container. Okay, so when I do that, I can actually, after doing that, I can make another image. Okay, this is Docker image, and I can make Docker image 1 version 1, which will have another subset like the MySQL and extra configuration. Okay, and if you want to involve the configurations in single repository, then you need to use something called as Docker Compose. Okay, so once you have Docker container, you can run these containers, you can modify underneath it, you can install software in it, and you can make your own customized image out of it and publish it to Docker, or store it at your local, or store it Azure. So once that is done, the image is converted into a container. Image is a read-only template composed of layered file system used to share count files and create Docker container instances. and contains an isolated and secured shipping container created from an image, and this can be run, started, stopped, and moved, or can be deleted at any point of time. So the same thing, so if you take a Docker client, so Docker client can be run on a Linux machine, can be run on Windows OS, and if it's a Linux machine, there's something called as Docker Engine daemon, which would be running. The same Docker Engine daemon would be running in Windows underneath your Windows operating system as well. Okay, and if you we talked in previous slides like where we have Linux container support called as Alexi, and here you can see Alexi. If it's Linux kernel, the only broker who can talk with Linux kernel is Linux Alexi. The same thing we will be talking about Alexi. If it's you want to run your Docker on Linux machine, you need to have Linux container Alexi will be there, and if it is, I mean, this Alexi is developed by Linux community itself, uh, because they need to create a sort of driver which can actually talk with Docker and the kernel, Linux kernel. The same Windows Server Container Support team did develop the same stuff, sort of driver between Docker engine and the Windows OS. Okay, that's a thing like where you have at uh, two steps depth on Docker stuff, and if you run like your application on virtual machine, as I talked, you need to have a host OS and guest OS. On top of that, you will be running. If on Docker containers, you doesn't need, like, these are the differences which we have between Docker and virtual machines. Okay, you doesn't need any Hyper-V, or neither you doesn't you need a guest OS underneath application. So what are the benefits of Docker is like you can accelerate developer onboarding. How does it can be done? Because whatever code you are developing right now, okay, and you have developed your project and it's been half completed, and there's been another guy or developer comes and joins your team, and he doesn't need to wait for setting up complete environment, everything. You just need to give this particular export it as a content, as an image to your coming incoming developer. So it will take your app1 bin slips files, everything, and it can run on any other Docker engine, and it will take all the configuration files which state that how to run this particular application or any configuration settings, and it can be run on any host operating system. Okay, so if this particular host operating system is Linux or Windows, you can run on you can give the image to the Docker image to that particular developer. He can run irrespective of whatever laptop or he carries out. Even if Mac OS he just need to install Docker engine, and he can run his application without setting up any environment or any other thing. He can directly work on the task directly. So that's a flexibility. But right now, in the traditional method approach, if a teammate joins company, then actually we need to look out whether he can work with a Mac or a Windows operating system, and then we need to decide and then give that particular setup, every configurations, everything, softwares, everything. But if I have this particular this Docker approach, then you just need to give an image what he would do, or the machine default systems would be having his Docker engine. He can just run that particular image directly onto the Docker engine, and he's ready to code on top of it. So that's what you can accelerate developer onboarding. There's something called as you can eliminate a lot of app conflicts. Okay, so your app conflicts can happen if you have various version of server which are prevailing in your production system. Okay, and your production your production server is configured in such a way that v1 server is having so different sort of configuration, and v2 is having different sort of configurations. Okay, and if you want to migrate your application from v1 to v2, then you need to take care of neutralize v1 and v2, that both are configurations. I mean the old system configuration, the new system configuration with respect to application, network, and other things should be same. If it is not, then the app1, app2, and app3, if even you are running on top of new server, stable server, good server, but it would fail. at some or the other place. So what Docker would do is, like, since we don't have any dependency of server configuration at OS level, we have in binlib and Docker engine level, so we doesn't need to bother about even it move to any other server. The configurations, everything remains intact. Environment consistency, which which is there, since we you can export complete configurations, everything. You can actually maintain different images. Okay, the different images, one particular image can have development softwares, everything, and connection strings, and another software which can have only staging the staging configurations, everything, and another image can have production. So each of these images, you can work on particular image, like development image can be having Docker Compose, having development credentials, can only be will not differ with if it's running with if it's running on staging or if it's running on prod. It would detect automatically and run that particular configurations only. Okay, that is consistency which Docker would maintain. And if you do this, then you are doing a lot of automation, right? You are trying to avoid a lot of roadblocks or unintended issues or bugs in between, or roadblocks in between your development. So obviously it would accelerate your product to ship faster to ship them faster to customer. So as I talked, you need to install Docker Toolbox irrespective of whatever it's Windows or Mac OS. Okay, and for Windows 10 you have Hyper-V. Windows 10 Enterprise you have Hyper-V, which you can work directly. And I'll let you know what other tool you need to install for Docker on Windows 10 plus machine. And this is for Docker.com. Docker Toolbox is for only machines which are below Windows 10 and then Mac machines. So Docker Toolbox would provide you an image, the boot to docker.iso, and it also have container tools. So, and one virtualization tool. Okay, so which is and virtual machine for Windows or Mac. So I said we need to go to Docker Toolbox and need to download the respect. I mean, with respect to what kind of bare metal OS we on top of which we want to run this particular Docker. And then the Docker Toolbox will have a client. It will have a Docker machine. It will have a Docker Compose. It will have VirtualBox and Docker Kinetic. So we know what is Docker client. We know what is VirtualBox, and we know Kinetic, but we don't know what is Docker machine and Compose. Let's talk about it. So Docker machine is the machine which it's a machine which makes it really easy to create Docker hosts. Docker hosts are nothing but Docker engines, or these are Linux VMs, or the boot to Docker ISO, which I was talking about. It would make this particular image available on boot on VirtualBox on my computer, okay, on my VirtualBox, and or it can be boot on a cloud provider or inside my own data center. It creates servers, install Docker on them, and then creates and then configures the Docker client to talk to them. Okay, so basically when I run VirtualBox, right? So when I run, I mean, there would be the Kitematic would be running certain commands related to Docker machine, which would actually create a server. I mean that it would create a boot to Docker dot the server, boot to Docker server, Linux server, and install a Docker on them, and then configure that Docker client to talk to them. Docker client is running on our bare metal machine, right? And it would actually talk with this particular Docker which would be installed and that particular VM, Linux VM, which we were running in our Mac OS. Okay, and once that is done, there's something called as Docker Compose. So Docker Compose is, like putting up all your configuration files related to, if you want to put, MySQL, or you want to put another configurations, or, or give a connection to SQL, which is hosted on Azure. You want to give the connection, on in a container. You will be giving in Docker Compose. So in certain cases, like you can see this particular command, Docker run name same WordPress, some WordPress name, some WordPress website. Link is you can give this particular WordPress link, and it needs MySQL port. This is MySQL. This is a MySQL port which is running on on the bare metal OS, and this is a MySQL port on the VM itself. Okay, the port number, and these are the port number which you need to mention, and then you would be linking with your WordPress. So my WordPress have the hosted on this particular MySQL. I mean, like, connected to this particular MySQL, and that need to be run on a container. Okay, so what this these all configurations, like, have a lot of port number, MySQL, everything, right? You can actually put this thing in a Docker Compose file, which makes your life easier, your statement easy. You can just say Docker run mywordpress.com. That's it. It would run your container rather than passing all the parameters which are required to run your Docker. Sorry. So with compose file to configure your application services. Then using a single command, you create and start all the services from your configurations. Okay. So we can put. So Docker Kitematic overview is Kitematic is a it's a GUI used to provision VMs and work with images and containers. It's visually search for Docker images, create, run, and manage containers. So this is the same thing which we were talking about. The Kitematic is nothing but this is a Kitematic. Sorry. This is a Kitematic. Okay. So then this So in this kinematics, we can see a lot of images which are there. I can go to my home. So you can see when I click new, I get all of the list of images which are available, okay, and which I can use from the Docker itself. Or you can go to Docker CLI, which actually opens up my bash. This one, okay. So this is the normal bash, and this is something called as something called as Docker Quickstart terminal. Okay, so that's two differences we have. What I go is, like, I'll go back to Kitematic, and then I'll go back to my slides. So you can visually search everything from the Docker Kitematic, blah blah blah, and then you have Docker Community Edition. Okay, this edition, I was talking about two things. Like, if you are using Windows 10 plus machine, you need to go to store.docker.com, and then you need to open this particular Docker for Windows. Okay, how to go there? Let me open my browser. So I have toolbox. I have something called as store.docker.com. Okay, when I go to store.docker.com, that's the main page which it would be having is the Docker C, or the Docker Community Edition for Windows enterprise machines. You need to install this per get Docker C. Okay, so it would install your Docker engine, everything on top of Hyper-V, which you get by default. Okay, for this you don't have much information. That's why I have added that video where you can resolve issues with Docker C while putting on two Windows. If you want to run your Docker process on Azure, you have C edition for Azure as well. Okay, and Ubuntu and other OSs as well, which is available, and you can avail at store.docker.com. Once that is done, and what you would be doing is, like, it's the same process. This is only one installation which will happen on Windows 10 plus machine, and after that you will be able to you can log in with any of your partial command line, because since it's have a native support with Hyper-V, you can run commands with PowerShell, or you can run commands with command line. Even the Docker commands you can run on partial or command line, and you can trigger call to Docker, okay, to Docker engine easily without installing any Quickstart terminal or anything else. You can work with your native console client applications. So once that is done, this is about Kitematic, which we have saw already. So this is a way like we can manually start, stop a service and container, right, from image. And there's something called as Docker machine. Resume. And then yes, Docker machine is Docker machine is is a keyword where which actually brings up when you run a command, and it would brings up a Docker host, okay, node, and then it's you can run your images as a container in underneath it. Okay, so what it can you can do is like create a managed local machines, okay, which would be inside a virtual box, and I mean whether it's boot to Docker